In a world buzzing with headlines, where conflict made more noise than compassion, a few had time to notice what was happening in a small country tucked quietly in the heart of West Africa, Burkina Faso. But it was there, inside a modest office in the capital city of Ouagadougou, that a moment of unexpected clarity was born, not from a general or a global summit, but from the handwritten words of a 12-year-old boy, President Ibrahim Traoré, just in his 30s, was sitting by the window when the envelope arrived. No wax seal, no national emblem, just a creased piece of paper, smudged slightly by a child's hand. The return address, a remote village near the Malian border. Inside was a short letter that read, "Dear Mr. President, I'm Amadou. I see people on the radio talk about war faraway places called Iran and Israel. I don't understand why grown-ups fight about old things. Can't someone ask them to stop?" Traoré read it twice. Then a third time. He folded the letter, placed it gently on his desk, and leaned back in silence. Outside, the hot sun baked the red earth. Inside, a storm was beginning to stir, not of anger, but of purpose. You see, Ibrahim Traoré wasn't like other world leaders. He wasn't molded in marble halls or taught to speak in diplomatic riddles. He grew up climbing mango trees and fetching water before dawn. He understood what it meant to survive with little, and how rare it was for someone with nothing to ask for everything. Peace. In the days that followed, advisors came and went with the usual reports, economic forecasts, infrastructure updates, regional concerns. But none of it pierced his mind the way Amadou's words had. One evening, during a routine cabinet meeting, Traoré surprised everyone. He set aside the folders, looked across the room, and said, "What if we were the ones to ask the question no one dares to ask anymore? What if Burkina Faso, not the most powerful, not the richest, asked for peace on behalf of those who are too small to be heard?" Silence filled the room. Some smiled politely, unsure if he was serious. But Ibrahim was already writing 2 letters in his head. Not speeches, not demands, just an invitation to talk, to listen, to be human again. And so, in a time when the world seemed split into sides and strategies, a young president in a sun-soaked country decided to do something quietly radical. He would write to Israel. He would write to Iran, not as a politician, but as a man, answering the question of a boy. There are moments in world history when the most powerful words are not shouted, but whispered. And this was one of those moments. In the dusty corridors of power, while media outlets filled screens with maps and predictions of escalation, 2 letters traveled silently across continents like seeds carried by the wind. One was headed toward Jerusalem, the other toward Tehran. They were signed not with grand titles or declarations, but with a quiet line from a man who knew the value of silence with respect. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. No red wax seal, no golden emblem, just sincerity. What made these letters different wasn't what they asked for, but what they didn't. They didn't come with political positioning. No demands for ceasefires. No talks of treaties. No language carefully crafted by foreign ministries. They simply offered a seat at a table far away from noise, a neutral place, under no flag, just space to sit, breathe, and remember what humanity sounds like. In the letter to Prime Minister Rosh HaMemshala of Israel, Traoré wrote, "Your people have endured suffering. Your nation has fought to survive. I do not come to question your past. I come to ask, can we imagine a future that doesn't repeat it?" And in the letter to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei of Iran, he said, "You have withstood storms, resisted pressures, and held your ground. I do not seek to sway your beliefs. I ask only, can we seek a moment that belongs not to power, but to peace for 3 days?" The world carried on, unaware. No headlines mentioned the letters. No analysts discussed them on air. Diplomats in big cities were too busy with the latest round of strategic positioning to notice that something was moving quietly beneath the surface. But then, replies came. Not through microphones. Not through podiums. Through silence first. And then, through action. Both leaders, independently and discreetly, agreed to send personal envoys not to a negotiation, but to a listening session, hosted at a private, neutral estate outside Geneva, Switzerland. No press, no protocols, no bodyguards in black sunglasses. Just 3 chairs, one for each nation, one table, no flags. And the man who sat between them was not a mediator with a PhD in conflict resolution. He was a soldier turned statesman who still remembered the taste of sand in his mouth as a boy, Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. He greeted both delegations with no pomp, no ceremony, just a gentle nod and one sentence, "Before we speak, I'd like to tell you a story." They didn't expect that, but they listened. Because somehow, without saying so, Traoré had become something they hadn't met in a long time, a man who had no stake, no ambition, and no judgment. He began softly. In Burkina Faso, there are 2 villages that sit on either side of a dying river. For years, they fought over fish, over water, over who had the right to dig deeper. And then, one year, the river dried out completely. That year, no one won. That year, children died. That year, elders wept. He paused. The following season, the 2 villages did something unthinkable. They didn't sign treaties. They didn't exchange conditions. They just picked up shovels and dug a new well together. The room was quiet. You see, Traoré wasn't asking Iran and Israel to become friends. He wasn't naive. He knew the history, the bloodlines, the wounds. But he was asking something far more difficult: to imagine the possibility of trying. That day in Geneva, there were no handshakes, no press photos. But for the first time in many years, representatives from both nations listened to each other, not to respond, but to understand. There were tense moments. Yes, years of pain cannot be erased in a single afternoon. But something shifted, and in the final hour of the quiet meeting, Traoré said, "Perhaps peace doesn't begin when we agree. Perhaps it begins the moment we choose not to walk away." When the delegations left the room, they didn't make joint statements. They didn't promise peace. But each one requested something unexpected. Can we speak again? And that right there was the beginning of a new story. Not a political one, a human one. Because when a forgotten president from a forgotten country dared to ask the oldest question in the simplest way, "Will you sit with me?" he reminded the world that diplomacy isn't always about strength. Sometimes, it's about humility. It's about a boy named Amadou who saw the world through clearer eyes than any adult. It's about letters written by hand, delivered without noise, and received without pride. And it's about choosing to speak not because we are sure we'll agree, but because silence, too often, becomes a permission for suffering to grow. In the days that followed, nothing changed on the surface, but underground a seed had been planted. Peace doesn't always come in thunder. Sometimes, it walks in barefoot. The room was quiet, the air still, the curtains drawn to dim the Swiss sunlight that filtered into the neutral meeting space. There were no microphones, no translators on earpieces, just 3 chairs around a round wooden table, simple, silent, and without flags. And in the center sat a man who didn't belong there, at least not by the usual standards of global diplomacy. But that was exactly why he did. President Ibrahim Traoré, wearing a modest tan shirt, with sleeves rolled up, had no interest in performance. He wasn't here to mediate history. He was here to remind it that listening is still possible. Across from him, 2 seasoned diplomats, one from Iran, one from Israel, stared with the cautious reserve of men who had been through too many talks that led nowhere. And then, Ibrahim spoke. But he didn't begin with politics. He didn't mention maps. He didn't mention missiles. He didn't even say the words ceasefire or treaty. Instead, he began with mango trees. "Where I come from," he said, "we don't plant mango trees for ourselves. They take years to bear fruit. The one I eat from today was planted by my grandfather. The one I planted last month will feed my granddaughter." The men listened, unsure where this was going. But that was the point. Ibrahim was not there to control the room. He was there to lower the room to bring everyone back to the same ground. Then he told them a story, a real one, about 2 villages in Burkina Faso, separated by a dying stream. For years, they blamed each other for everything: overgrazing, damming, poisoning the water. They fought. They built fences. They sabotaged each other's wells at night. And then one year, the river dried up, completely. The land stopped choosing sides. Traoré said, it made both suffer, equally. That year, livestock died, crops failed, and suddenly, the reason for the fight no longer mattered, because there was nothing left to fight for. One day, an elder from the southern village walked across the dry riverbed with nothing but a wooden stool and a tin cup. He sat down near the border and began digging barehanded. He didn't speak. He didn't wave a flag. By nightfall, a young man from the northern village came and joined him. He didn't speak either. Within 3 days, 20 men were digging. By the end of the week, they hit water. They didn't name the well after a tribe. They didn't post guards. They simply drank, together. Traoré paused, looking at both sides of the table. That well didn't end every disagreement, he said softly, but it ended the silence. For the first time that day, both diplomats shifted slightly forward. You see, something strange was happening in that room. No one was debating. No one was defending. They were remembering what it felt like to be people, not officials, not nations, just men, sitting around a table, hearing about thirst and the miracle of water found through shared struggle. The Israeli diplomat cleared his throat, almost reluctantly, and said, "But we've tried wells before. Each one was poisoned the next year." Traoré nodded. "Then maybe," he replied, "the well should be dug somewhere, where no one owns the soil." He let that sit. Maybe the next well is not between your borders. Maybe it's between your hearts. The Iranian envoy looked up. And who will drink first? The children. Ibrahim answered. Always the children. What followed was not a negotiation. No documents were passed. No signatures were made. But for the next hour, the three men spoke not about governments, but about fathers, about funerals, about hope. One shared a story of his daughter hiding under the stairs during an air raid. Another recalled burying his cousin, who had never known a day without fear. Ibrahim spoke of a girl he once met in Burkina Faso, who asked, "Do leaders ever cry when people die?" It was that question that left the room in silence once again. And that silence, it wasn't awkward. It was sacred, because it was the sound of walls softening. By the end of the meeting, no one stood and clapped. No cameras flashed. But something was left on the table unwritten. Invisible, but undeniably real respect. Not agreement. Not compromise, but respect. And from that seed, things would grow. As the Israeli envoy stood to leave, he extended his hand first. A subtle bow. A gesture not of surrender, but of recognition. The Iranian diplomat nodded and said quietly, "Perhaps one day, our grandchildren will sit at a table like this and laugh at how hard we made things." President Ibrahim smiled, but said nothing. He knew better than to ruin a perfect moment with words. As the men walked out of the quiet house in the Swiss countryside, birds were singing. It was spring, and just beyond the stone wall outside, there was a small patch of soil, freshly turned by the gardener that morning. Traoré walked over, knelt, and without fanfare, placed a single mango seed into the earth. He didn't say who it was for. He didn't have to. Some things speak for themselves. Peace is rarely announced. It doesn't arrive with parades or banners or breaking news. Sometimes, peace begins as a door, left slightly open. After the quiet meeting in Geneva, there were no headlines, no ceremonies, no photographs for the world to see. The media didn't report on it, because there was nothing to report. No treaty had been signed, no concessions made, and yet something had changed. Back in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré didn't speak of the meeting to his cabinet. He didn't tweet a summary or give a speech to the nation. He simply returned to his schedule as if nothing had happened. But in his heart, he carried something new. Hope not as an idea, but as a weight. Because now, the possibility existed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, subtle gestures began to ripple. In Israel, a senior aide from the Prime Minister's office quietly contacted an international humanitarian agency with a specific request. "Can you help us identify children displaced by recent unrest? No publicity. Just send us the list." The agency was stunned. It had been years since any government requested neutral humanitarian coordination across such fragile lines. But just days later, the same agency received a separate message, this time from Tehran. "We have lost children. 2. We are willing to cooperate, discreetly." It wasn't a formal agreement. It wasn't a joint effort. But it was a beginning. And in Geneva, a tiny humanitarian office long overlooked and underfunded suddenly found itself serving as the quiet bridge between two worlds that had never touched hands before. It started with names. Names of children who had gone missing in conflict zones. Dozens of names. Then, photographs. Then one day, a confirmed match. A boy named Samir. Aganina. His father was in Jerusalem. His aunt was in Mashhad. Both had been searching. Both believing he was lost. Now, they were speaking to each other. Not through embassies. Through love. Within weeks, 5 more children were found. No one announced it. But families wept in private. And somewhere, deep in the Sahel, President Ibrahim sat alone one morning and opened a brown envelope. Inside were 6 photographs. 6 children. Reunited. And one simple note: your mango tree has begun to sprout. He closed the folder, smiled, and whispered to himself, Amadou, you were right. Still, there were no headlines. Because the world wasn't built to notice small things. It's addicted to drama, to conflict, to declarations. But something different was happening now, not loud. Not political, just real. Across borders. Quiet teams of aid workers and local volunteers were now exchanging information about refugee camps. Missing families. Wounded children. A channel had opened. And though it was narrow, it was sacred. Of course, not everyone welcomed it. Hardliners, in both governments, raised eyebrows. Some quietly criticized their leaders for showing weakness. Others warned that small gestures lead to big complications. But Traoré knew better. He knew that real courage isn't making noise. It's keeping your word when no one is watching. One evening, during a community gathering in Ouagadougou, a journalist asked Traoré directly, Mr. President, did your meeting in Switzerland achieve anything? He paused, then gave a simple answer. A mother found her child. No follow-up question was needed. Because what more could peace possibly mean? Later that month, the small Geneva office received an unexpected request. A mid-level Iranian official asked to visit an interfaith hospital in Tel Aviv, not as a diplomat, but as a doctor. Permission was granted. A week later, an Israeli nurse volunteered for a joint medical seminar hosted in Oman. These were tiny steps, barely visible on the world stage. But make no mistake, they were steps. And behind each of them stood the shadow of a man who refused to take credit. Traoré never mentioned the word peace initiative. He never called it a plan or a project. He called it what it was, the well. And when asked by an international news outlet what Burkina Faso's interest was in all this, he simply replied, "We have no interest. Only empathy." It was that sentence, quiet, almost forgettable, that found its way into classrooms across Africa. Teachers began sharing the story of the 2 villages and the well. Children wrote their own letters to their leaders, asking questions the world had long forgotten how to ask. In Iran, a poet published a piece called "The Man Who Dug Without Borders." In Israel, a mural appeared overnight in Jaffa of 2 hands sharing water from the same cup. And in a village near the border of Mali, young Amadou received a visit from a government driver one dusty afternoon. He stepped out of a plain car, handed Amadou a small wooden box, and said, "This is from the president." Inside was a single photograph of the Geneva table and a sapling mango tree growing from the dirt just beyond it. On the back, a note in simple handwriting you asked. They listened. "Keep asking." Amadou held the photo to his chest and said nothing. Some stories are too sacred for words. And though the world still carried its chaos, its conflicts, its cynicism somewhere, in the middle of it all, there was now a path, narrow, quiet, fragile, but real. Because peace may not knock down the front door, but sometimes it finds its way in through the smallest crack. There were no statues built, no international prizes, no marble plaques bearing his name, because the man who began it all never asked for recognition. He simply kept walking quietly like a gardener who plants seeds and never waits for the fruit. President Ibrahim Traoré returned to Burkina Faso as he had left without fanfare. No global press conference, no victory tour, just a dusty road, the hum of cicadas, and a folded letter from a boy named Amadou, still in his coat pocket, in his private journal, kept in longhand. Never typed, he wrote just one line that week. If you plant something with clean hands and leave it alone, the sun will know what to do. And indeed, it did. Months after the Geneva meeting, the world still looked the same on the surface. The same arguments in the news, the same tensions at borders, the same cynicism in politics. But underground, something had shifted. A well had been dug, and its water was reaching places that diplomacy had failed to touch. From Iran to Israel, humanitarian bridges continued to grow, not through policy, but through people, medical volunteers, aid workers, students exchanging handwritten letters, faith leaders quietly exchanging prayers over encrypted messages. These were not headlines. They were heartlines, invisible, but strong. And when asked one afternoon by a young journalist if he considered his effort a success, Traoré smiled softly. I wasn't trying to succeed. I was trying to be sincere. Those who knew him said that was always his strength. Not ambition, not charisma, but stillness. The ability to sit with people not above them, to listen, even when silence was easier, to act, even when applause was unlikely. In time, the small Geneva room where the first meeting had taken place was turned into a permanent, neutral space, a quiet initiative supported by several nations, but always credited to a citizen from the Sahel. Traoré's name was never engraved there, but near the entrance stood a mango tree, planted by hand, and beneath it, a simple wooden bench with the words, "Some wells are built with water, others with trust." Years later, school children across Africa would hear the tale in their own words. The president who answered a boy's question, the soldier who brought no weapons to a battlefield, the man who believed the smallest voices could change the loudest world. And in the village where young Amadou lived, he became something of a local legend himself. He started a youth club, Diggers of the Well. They called it no politics, just purpose. They cleaned water stations, wrote letters to peace builders, planted trees in villages that had once been divided by land disputes. One day, a man from the ministry visited Amadou and said, "The president would like to know how you're doing." Amadou, now a teenager, looked up from the sapling he was watering and answered, "Tell him, the tree is growing." That message reached Traoré in the middle of a long workday. He paused, stared out his window, and quietly closed his folder, because sometimes, when the world demands action, what it truly needs is reflection. In the end, there was no treaty named after Ibrahim Traoré. no international monument carved in his honor. But there was a shift, a subtle realignment in how leaders thought about diplomacy, how children thought about courage, and how a tired world, starved of hope. He began to remember the power of gentle beginnings. Because in a time obsessed with being first, strongest, and loudest, one man proved that being still, kind, and true could move more than armies ever could. And long after the cameras turned away, long after the critics moved on, and the noise returned, the well remained, still full, still shared, still quietly saving lives.